What is it about Greenville, South Carolina that has so many people looking to relocate? This week, we're going to break down some of the reasons why people are looking to relocate here to the Greenville area of South Carolina. Hey guys, it's Bill Stewart with Remax Moves here in Simpsonville, South Carolina, and just thought I would take an opportunity to talk about what I'm seeing personally, like what drove my family and us to Greenville, as well as just kind of ask clients why, when they're relocating, what is it about Greenville that has them coming here. And I just thought that it would be an interesting concept to kind of talk about the area, especially from somebody who's only been here for about 5 years, and what drove my family into this area, what we love about it, as well as like what we're hearing from clients as to the reasons why this area attracts them. So we'll get right into it. So I grew up in Florida. Well, really, I spent about 30 years in Florida. My dad was a military pilot for the Air Force. We moved around a lot as a kid. So I spent it seemed like every 2 to 3 years, we were packing up our bags and moving somewhere until I was about 13. And that's when we ended up landing in Florida on the East Coast, Satellite Beach, Florida, right outside of Cape Canaveral. My dad was stationed at Patrick Air Force Base. And when we got to Florida, it was it was incredible. Like we were like a couple blocks from the beach. We lived on the intercoastal. It was a really great environment. When I guess it was probably about year 4 or 5 where that's where it kind of felt like, oh my gosh, we actually have roots. We've been somewhere longer than 2 to 3 years. And it was actually one of the first communities that we lived in where it wasn't predominantly a military community. People actually lived there. They grew up there. So, it wasn't as much turnover, I guess, in terms of like the kids and families that were in the area. So it felt very much like home. And I remember thinking like, I'm never leaving Florida. But as I got older, I moved from Satellite Beach. I moved to Orlando. From Orlando, I moved to Gainesville. From Gainesville, I moved to Jacksonville. From Jacksonville, I moved back to Orlando, then back to Satellite Beach, or Melbourne, really, and then back to Orlando. And so over the course of 30 years, I had seen a lot of Florida. And I remember it was probably as I started getting into my late 20s where I was like, I love Florida, but there's a lot of things about Florida that, I was wanting a change. And maybe that's the military kid in me that just, at that point finally was like, it's time to move after, being there for 15, 20 years. But I always wanted to, even though we lived near the beach, I was always drawn to the mountains. So it was always wanting to be somewhere where there was elevation. One great thing about Florida is you got a lot of beaches. One bad thing about Florida is that it's completely flat. So in general, like the landscape doesn't really change unless there's a building in front of you. And so I had vacationed a lot in areas with mountains, and I wanted to be somewhere closer to it. So, but over the years of living in Florida, what I found was like, our population exploded over the time that we were there. From when I first moved there were a lot of people, but it was like, the towns, the cities really grew up. Orlando exploded. Miami was definitely always a big city, but it was getting bigger. St. Pete, Tampa were getting really big. Jacksonville's the largest city in the country in terms of from a square mile perspective. And it was really starting to fill in. So it was one of those things where it just felt like that, we were starting to gain into a point where there was a huge amount of population, which then at that point came with things like traffic, road congestion. And so, you were constant. I felt like I was living in traffic. I worked about 30 minutes away from our house. And some days, with no traffic, it would take me 30 minutes, but on days where there was traffic, I could be on a commute anywhere between an hour and a half, sometimes 2.5 hours. So it really started to go. And on top of that, most of the roads that I had to travel were toll roads that were built out of necessity in order to help kind of ease some of that congestion. But along with that came a cost. And sometimes, I'd be spending anywhere between $8 to $10 a day in tolls. And so, that started to grind after a while as well. That, population, the number of people that were coming, more homes were being built, but they were kind of crammed all in together. So you had neighborhoods that just springing up all over the place. And so at that point, it was starting to drive up price. The demand for housing was high. And so the average median price was moving up, considerably. And I think, right now it's somewhere in the high 4s. In some areas, it's as high as 600, 700. It just really kind of depends where you're located in terms of what the average household is. And it's been a while since I've been there, but I just remember thinking like, how much what was my money going to get me? How much privacy would I get in terms of like not feeling like I was just right next door or being huddled into these, zero lot line neighborhoods. To get a little bit more distance, you really had to end up paying for it. So it came at a premium. And so at that point, like the housing price was just, it felt like it was starting to get unreachable and so at that point, like we really had to evaluate that. And a lot of those neighborhoods too are also HOA neighborhoods. So the cost of the cost of the HOAs were also moving up. And so it wasn't just about the home price. Now it was about all the other incremental costs that came up. So, including things like home insurance with all the storms and everything else like that we had over the years that I'd been there. Property insurance had moved up considerably to a point where we were running out of insurance companies or had very limited choice in terms of insurance companies. In fact, my wife and our insurance company dropped us and said that they were going out of business. And so we had not had to shop home insurance for years. And I remember like realizing that there was probably like 3 or 4 companies that we could actually work with. And so the cost of that had gone up because of the fact that there just weren't a lot of companies doing it. And so at that point it was either take it or leave it. The other was property taxes. Property taxes were moving up on an annual basis at a pretty high rate. Florida does not have, income tax. So, a lot of that, you're going to pay a little bit higher in property taxes, which we understood. But the reality was that the property taxes were just increasing. It seemed like every year I was looking down, it was another $200, $300 a year. And so at that point, it was like, over the course of 10 years, that's a pretty substantial amount of money that's going into your escrow account, and it's increasing your monthly bills. And then the other was, weather as a whole. It was getting hotter, like the summers were getting hotter. We would be in the high 90s and it felt like, into high 90s into the hundreds at points where, years past you would hit the 90s, but it was really more in the high 80s. Well, when the heat's on, when it's hot outside, you're going to have to, in order to be able to keep environments cool, you got to run your AC a little bit more. And so at that point, like our utility expenses, we could see our utility expenses starting to climb up over the time. So, weather wasn't just about storms. It was about the heat. It felt like the humidity and the heat just persisted, and it's hot for the most part year round, which some people like. I personally, it was getting to me. The heat was starting to get to me. The humidity was starting to get to me. I like doing things outside. I like working in the yard. I like cutting grass and doing, all of the things outside. It was getting to be so hot that it was like, I felt like from a health standpoint that it was actually a risk because I'm getting older. And so at that point, like I never would have had thought about it as a kid, but as I'm getting older, I can feel that it affects me a lot more. So it was really one of those, as it was getting hotter and it was staying hotter for longer, that was really kind of a challenge. So it was like, I'm ready to start looking around. So we're working with clients right now that are relocating from Florida, and we started talking, they're from Miami or outside of Miami. And so like a lot of what we're talking about, they were just like, yeah, that's what we're looking for. So then at that point, it's like, well, what are you looking for out of that next spot? Well, what I looked at was there was a criteria. My wife gave me a criteria. I could not be in a place where there was harsh winters. We wanted to be in the Eastern time zone. We did not want to we wanted to be in a central location between our families. Her mom and dad live in New York. We have family and friends in Florida or in the Orlando area and other areas. My dad lives in Oak Island, North Carolina. And so at that point, we wanted to be somewhere that was central, that would offer a better, like I would say, not necessarily a slower pace of life, but just a little bit calmer lifestyle. And at that point still offered things like job opportunities. And, basically we were looking for what I would consider like a unicorn out of all the places that you could choose, where it was cost of living is lower, but the benefit and the overall quality of life is increased. Typically those things don't hand in hand. And then at that point, like we kind of stumbled across Greenville and really started to do research about Greenville specifically, what made it up, what was going on, how does it look? And I remember just being like coming up here and visiting where it was a breath of fresh air. It was like, man, oh my gosh, there's so much to do, in the area. You've got, really 4 distinct seasons in this area, but you don't have harsh winters. So it's not like you're going to get blizzard conditions during the winter. It gets cold, and we do get snow from time to time, but there are years where you don't get any snow, and then there's some years like last year we got a couple of dustings. It gets cold, but it's not bitterly cold, and it could be 16 or 20 degrees in the morning, but 50 degrees in the afternoon. So it's one of those, like, the only thing I would say about winter is sometimes you have to have you have to be planning and have, 3 sets of clothes, or at least have layers on to adjust to where it is, because it'll be cold in the morning, warmer in the afternoon, then cold again in the afternoon when the sun comes down. So it's just being prepared for those things, but it's definitely not easy. But fall in this area is absolutely incredible. The leaves changing. It was something that we did not see a lot of in Florida, at least not on the coast of Florida. So, everything that you see about, as the holiday starts to move around, you've got Halloween, Thanksgiving, all of the fall holidays. I think it just, with the color with the trees changing, leaves changing, and all of that it's basically, it really does feel like fall here. And, and it's great because there's a lot of things a lot of different markets, fall markets, outdoor markets, that there's a lot of things to do in this area as far as like going out to pumpkin patches or doing apple picking or those things that you have opportunity to be able to do that all within like a very short drive in and around. Spring is also an incredible time in that, it's cooler during the evenings, a little bit warmer during the days, but there's a bunch of stuff in terms of like strawberry festivals and things like that go on. And so kind of the seasons and the outdoor activities. You're also 30 minutes away from the mountains, really in any direction. You're about an hour and 15 minutes away from Asheville. So if you want to go up to Asheville, you're very close from our area. We sit about 2 hours from Charlotte, 2.5 hours from Atlanta. So in terms of like big cities in and around us, we're very close. Columbia is only about an hour and a half away, the state capital. So you're really in a great centralized location too. So if you need to travel or you're traveling, doing something, Greenville has a great airport, but if you need more availability, Charlotte's not that far, Atlanta's not that far, Columbia's not that far. So you've got options and choices in order to be able to like make it, get to where you're trying to go without having to go too far. So one of the other things is, here in South Carolina, we had to evaluate. There is an income tax, which we weren't paying in Florida. But when we started netting out things like our property tax, our property insurance, the lack of things like tolls that we were having to pay, lower car insurance, just because of the fact that like the population wasn't quite as high. And then generally just the cost of living as a whole. When we put all those things together, we've never even thought twice. It never really impacted us too much. We were the savings that we saw on all the other categories more than made up for the difference of what we would be paying towards property taxes or towards income taxes. And ultimately, I feel like we probably still made out better in terms of positive back to us from an overall like cost of living perspective. Home prices here, yeah, we've seen a growth in home prices. Like, over at least even in my time, like while we've been here for 5 years, I've watched home prices move up pretty good. But the reality is like it's sustainable growth. It's not too high, not too low. The real estate market here is, I would say, probably one of the most stable that are around, because of the fact that we are becoming a destination, but we have there are big employers in this area, whether it's Lockheed Martin, BMW, Michelin, there's several others, and then businesses that have been brought here because of that, as well as you pretty much have all of the big box retailers, big box restaurants, all of those that you would have in a big city in this area. And there's a thriving small business community that comes here, whether it be a retailer, restaurant, bars, distilleries, those there's a lot of small businesses that really thrive in this area. And when you start looking at the different towns between, whether it be Woodruff, whether it be Simpsonville, whether it be Taylor's, Greer, each little town has its own little character. And it's like you have some of these have historic downtowns. You start to see buildings like old mill buildings that are being repurposed and put into things like, retail, restaurants, it really adds a different character to it, and it really makes these little downtown areas thrive. So you've got, your downtown Greenville is great, and there's a lot to offer, but the little towns in and around Greenville also have their own beat, life, everything. And I think it's just really great to see that. Something that I don't really feel like we had in Florida, just because everything was always turning over. It was always new. Everything seemed stucco. There was not a lot of brick. So it's just the look, feel, kind of the heritage and the history that goes along in this area, I think is pretty neat. And so, we are growing, but the congestion here is nowhere near what we were seeing in Florida in terms of traffic. In fact, like Woodruff Road, Woodruff Road is busy. It's a busy road, and traffic is typically horrible, depending on what kind of day you're on and depending on where you're trying to get to. But it's still not nearly as bad as Florida. It's still not nearly as bad as driving downtown Orlando or into Miami or down the turnpike. It has its moments. I have yet to really get frustrated with traffic while living here. And the nice thing is there are a lot of different cut roads or back roads or things like that you can get around some of the bigger and the more congested areas of roads like that in this area. Woodruff's not the only one. I'm just using that because I live off of Woodruff Road. And so, there's ways to get in and out once you kind of learn, but in general, traffic it's relatively easy to get to and from pretty much anywhere, whether it's from Greenville, Spartanburg, out to the surrounding areas. But the closer you get to the cities like Greenville, Spartanburg, Columbia, traffic is obviously going to be a thing, but it's definitely I'll take it any day of the week. And I'm not having to pay tolls. So we only have one toll road here that I'm aware of. That's I-85 or 185. And every once in a while I'll ride on it and always forget to put any money in my pocket because of the fact that I'm not used to paying tolls, and thankfully they take credit cards. So, but really what we found when we moved here was people are genuinely nice. Coming from Orlando, I think anytime you live in a big city, it's not that there's not nice people. It's just that in general, formalities and pleasantries are kind of forgotten because of the fact that you're always moving at 100 miles an hour. You don't have a lot of time. Traffic, overpopulation, a lot of times that will, you just don't have time for it. So moving here where it was people actually, introduced themselves, wanted to know what was going on. Neighborhoods actually, neighbors knew each other. I couldn't tell you. We probably knew 3 or 4 of our neighbors in our last couple neighborhoods, and that was about it. In neighborhood that we're in now, I feel like we know pretty much, well, at least we know a far bigger percentage than we did from Florida. But one of the things was, it was probably the first week we were here, what I noticed was we would be pulling out of places like on Woodruff Road, for as busy as it is, we'd be pulling out either grocery store or Kohl's or wherever we were trying to go gather things as we were getting moved in, that I remember saying, I was people would stop and let you into traffic. And I thought that was to me, it was I know we've picked the right place because that would never happen in Florida. You would be sitting there forever. So either you're an aggressive driver or you would be left behind. And so here, where people actually took the time and took the moment and were okay to allow those to go, I was that's it. I feel like we've made the right choice. So there's a lot of great things about this area in regards to what makes it, why I think it attracts people and what it attracted us. And as I talk to clients who are making the relocation, they could be from other areas outside of Florida, but it seems like what they're looking for is similar to what drew us here. And that, I think that's a testament to what's great about this area. And I tell my kids all the time, I ask my kids, I should say, are you happy that we're in South Carolina? They always say yes. Will we go? And the question is, would you go back to Florida if you had an opportunity? And it's a resounding no. So, I feel like we made a good choice. I am truly happy here. It's such a great place to live and work. And, they're anywhere, it's not perfect, but in general, I would say it's as close to perfect as I can find. So anyway, I don't know if that's helpful. I just figured, I hear a lot about why, I hear a lot of people talking, or I talk to clients that are interested in the concept, on the idea of like relocating. And so I just figured it's interesting when I'm talking to people, I'm like, that's why I moved here. That's why I moved here, to share it across, in a format that at that point, like hopefully add some help, or at least give some perspective of somebody who, I feel like I'm still relatively new to the area, even though we've been here for 5 years. But the reasons why, what we see now 5 years later, would I make the same decision? Hands down. So anyway, hopefully this is helpful. If it is helpful, if this content is helpful in any way, I would encourage you, please hit the like and subscribe button. We do this every week. We just kind of like on a topic, whether it's about real estate, the community, Greenville, what's going on. So we'd love to be able to like continue to bring that information to you. If you have any questions about Greenville, the Greenville real estate market, areas in and around Greenville or Spartanburg, or really anywhere in the upstate, or just curious to know more about what it would look like, or what you would need to do from if you were going to start the process of relocation, I'd love the opportunity to have that conversation. Please, my email, phone number, feel free to call, email, text, whatever you're most comfortable with. I'd love to be able to start that conversation. And anyway, I hope you have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.